Hello, AP Macro students, here we go. Today it's going to be a quick video, well, I don't know how quick it will be, but we'll try to get through it as quickly as we can, about how to graph all of these monetary policies that we just learned. So hopefully by now you've already either seen the entire previous video over monetary policy or you saw it in class and you understand that the Fed is trying to manipulate the money supply in order to manipulate the economy, and that these are all demand-side policies, right? Hopefully you understand required reserve ratio, and you understand the discount rate. Hopefully you understand open market operations and how they're used to achieve the Fed funds rate target. And then finally, hopefully you understand TAF, term auction facility. These are all the different tools of the Fed. What we need to do now is two things. One, we need to learn how to graph those policies on really three different graphs, one of which is going to be new to you in this video. So we're going to be learning the money market graph. We'll also be putting these policies onto the loanable funds graph, which you already know, and then also we'll be putting these onto the aggregate supply and demand model, which is the second thing we need to do. So first we're graphing these things. The second thing we need to do here is connect changing the money supply with actual aggregate demand. Where is the connection? How come when the Fed changes the money supply, that results in a shift in aggregate demand? That's what we're going to get to the bottom of. And if we understand how to graph monetary policy and connect it to the aggregate model, we're done with the topic. So here we go. Let's dive right in. First thing I want to do is teach you our new graph. Our new graph is called the money market graph, and it is literally just a graph of the money supply. So I'm going to go ahead and move this down. For the rest of the video, I'll probably have the top of my head cut off here, but the primary stage is my whiteboard. So let's learn our new graph. This is called the money market graph. Money market, that's what that says. And it's going to start like most of our graphs do. It is a supply and demand graph. This is the supply and demand of money itself. And the price of money, for reasons that we really don't even need to get into, but normally the price of money is an interest rate, right? How much does it cost to borrow that money? Well, in this case, it's nominal interest rates. Okay? So the other one is going to be quantity, right? All supply and demand graphs are a relationship between price and quantity. So the price of money versus the quantity of money. And there is a downward sloping demand. And all this is telling us is that if interest rates are high, not a lot of money is going to be demanded. We're not going to borrow as much money. If interest rates are super low, a higher quantity of money will be demanded. Now here's the peculiar thing. And that word means strange for those of you who don't know. Okay, here's the strange thing. The thing that's different about the money market graph. The thing that's different about money in general is, where does it come from? All of it comes from the Fed. There's one source for money. Okay, the Fed has monopoly control over the money supply. And what that means is, it doesn't matter what interest rates are. There's only one quantity of money out there. So the supply of money is vertical. And by the way, we want to use money supply and money demand here. Okay, so put MS and MD. I'm going to clean that up because it doesn't look very good. So we have money supply and money demand. Money supply is vertical, and this is the M1 supply of money. This is a money market graph. Take a picture of it, draw this in your notes, memorize it. If I ask you to draw a money market graph, this is what you draw. So why are we learning this right now? Well, we've already kind of discovered, or we've talked a lot about at least, that monetary policy is Fed efforts to control or manipulate the economy through controlling and manipulating the money supply. So graphing monetary policy on this graph is incredibly straightforward because monetary policy is about increasing and decreasing the money supply itself. So if there's an expansionary monetary policy, it really is this simple. The Fed just increased the money supply. That's it, right? Exactly what you think it should be. The Fed increased the money supply. Well, the Fed increased the money supply here on our graph. Now, what's the result? Why are we doing this? Well, we always do supply and demand because we want to discuss prices. And in this case, the price is nominal interest rates. Here's our big takeaway. Expansionary monetary policy lowers interest rates. That's the big takeaway. Expansionary monetary policy lowers interest rates. So let's go ahead and practice what a contractionary monetary policy would look like. We'll start off with our standard graph. Here we are. You have your vertical money supply, M1. Interest rate, nominal interest rate. Quantity, money supply, money demanded. Contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy aims to decrease the money supply, so we decrease the money supply. And therefore raise interest rates. Not too hard, right? That really is all of graphing monetary policy on our new graph, the money market. Now, let's go ahead and put monetary policy on one of the graphs we already know, which is the Fed funds graph. Fed funds graph looks like this. I'm sorry, it's not the Fed funds graph. It's the loanable funds graph. It's the loanable funds graph. So, the loanable funds graph looks like this. It's called loanable funds, positive quadrant. This is real interest rates. We want to keep that straight, not nominal. Nominal interest rates are on the money market graph. Loanable funds graph is real interest rates. You have the quantity of loanable funds, and this one is a typical X, supply and demand. Now, loanable funds is the money that's in the bank that banks can lend out to other banks, right? Or to people, actually. Okay? It's money that banks can loan out to people. So, if the Fed is doing an expansionary monetary policy, really what they're doing is encouraging bank lending. And the way they encourage bank lending is through basically doing open market operations and manipulating the Fed funds rate, right? And when you do an open market operation that's expansionary, you buy bonds. Remember, buy big, right? And we remember from T accounting that buying bonds means the amount of money that the Fed gives to banks in exchange for the bond goes directly into excess reserves. And those excess reserves really are the same thing as the supply of loanable funds. So expansionary monetary policy looks like this. It's simply an increase in the supply of loanable funds. And look at this. What happens to real interest rates? They go down. So hopefully right now it just clicked for you that on both the loanable funds graph and the money market graph, monetary policy is simply increasing and decreasing supply on both of those graphs. And in order to kind of bring that home, let's put both graphs next to each other. All right, here we have loanable funds graph next to a money market graph. And if I wanted to graph monetary policy on both of these graphs at the same time, all I would do is either increase or decrease the supply on both of these. Now, it's for different reasons. On the money market graph, if I'm graphing expansionary monetary policy, I'm increasing the money supply because that's exactly what expansionary monetary policy is. It's increasing the money supply through various means. Required reserve ratio, the discount rate, the Fed funds rate target, open market operations, or TAF, right? That's what we're aiming to do. We're aiming to change the money supply. The loanable funds graph, I shift supply to the right because the way that increase in the money supply really looks when you look at a bank's balance sheet is it increases a bank's excess reserves, which is actually loanable funds. And in both of these, interest rates go down. And the opposite is true if you do a contractionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy shifts supply on both graphs to the left. Interest rates go up. Now, a couple of things that I want to note before we move on from this. The first thing that I want to note is this. How are you going to keep it straight? Which interest rate goes with which graph? I've got a really cheesy memorization device for you, but it works. So here we go. I always say that I like money, or I heart money, and economics is real fun. Okay, so there you go. The loanable funds graph goes with real interest rates, and the money market graph goes with nominal interest rates, because I heart money and economics is real fun. So hopefully you don't confuse those two. Now, second thing that I want to talk to you about. I have gone on probably more than one tangent already about how all of these policies are demand-side policies, including monetary policy. That monetary policy is not a supply-side policy, is an aggregate demand policy. All counter-cyclical policies aim to manipulate aggregate demand. And I yell at you about this because I know you're going to make the same mistake. You are going to want to manipulate short-run aggregate supply when you do monetary policy. And now you can see why you're going to do that. The reason why you might make that mistake is because on these two graphs, monetary policy manipulates supply. But I really need you to do whatever it is that you have to do to internalize and understand and really get that supply on these two graphs has nothing to do with aggregate supply. There is only one short-run aggregate supply. It is the entire aggregate supply of GDP in an economy at a given price level. That's what short-run aggregate supply is. Supply on these graphs is, in this case, the supply of money, and in this case, the supply of loanable funds. Don't shift short-run aggregate supply when you're doing monetary policy. Both of these graphs show a shift in supply, which is a very different thing than aggregate supply. This will still result, when we graph monetary policy on the aggregate model, in a shift in aggregate demand. Please understand that, because this is the most common mistake made by students in this course. Okay? Now, we're almost to the point where we can go ahead and connect this finally to aggregate demand. How is it that we get from this to aggregate demand? Why is it that monetary policy is, in fact, a demand-side policy? Well, let's go ahead and put a timeout. Before we talk about that, I want to show you fiscal policy on both of these graphs. Because yes, you can actually graph fiscal policy on both the money market, and you already know that you can graph fiscal policy on the loanable funds graph. We learned the loanable funds graph doing fiscal policy, if you recall, right? We used this because it was a good tool for us to learn, or at least talk about, crowding out. We talked about the loanable funds theory of interest rates. Give me 1 second. We talked about the loanable funds theory of interest rates and how when the federal government does expansionary policy, it creates deficits. And deficits mean that the government has to borrow money to pay for increased spending, especially when they're decreasing taxes at the same time. And the whole idea was that represents an increase in the demand for loans. And that drives up interest rates. And then the crowding out argument says, well, because interest rates are going higher, that gross private investment gets lower. Gross private investment is crowded out by increased government borrowing. So you know how to do fiscal policy on this graph. You shift demand. Well, in this case, we're doing expansionary. We're shifting demand to the right. The same concept and reasoning applies to the money market graph. If the government is trying to stimulate the economy, meaning there's more consumption spending and there's more government spending, there's more demands on money itself. The money demand goes up. And what's the result on nominal interest rates? It goes up. Okay? So, we have a really convenient set of graphing circumstances here with these graphs. Okay? And I'm going to put it into kind of a rule for you. when graphing fiscal policy and monetary policy, or we could just say at this point, when graphing counter-cyclical policies on the money market and the loanable funds graph, you can follow these two rules. For fiscal policy, shift demand on both graphs. For monetary policy, shift supply on both graphs. For all policies, and this is where we're going next, shift aggregate demand on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply graph. Okay, there are your rules. Internalize these. These rules will help you. Anytime you're dealing with countercyclical policies and interest rates, which is a lot, this is kind of what's asked about often, is what is the result on interest rates? If the federal government pursues some fiscal policy, what's the impact on interest rates? Draw one of the graphs. If monetary policy is going to be contractionary, what is the impact on interest rates? Draw one of the graphs. Okay? Fiscal policy, you're going to be shifting demand on both graphs. Monetary policy, you're going to be shifting supply on both graphs. But don't make this a mistake where you want to shift short-run aggregate supply on the aggregate model, because you don't. On all policies, shift aggregate demand. So, let's finish things up. And let's go ahead and connect monetary policy to the aggregate model. And maybe some of you have already picked up on this. But if you haven't, here we go. If you want to shift aggregate demand, you have to shift SIGEX. You have to find one or some of these components of aggregate demand to manipulate. We already know that fiscal policy manipulates consumption and government spending. What is the big thing that results from monetary policy, though? Well, let's go to our money market graph that we just learned. The money market, the money supply, and money demand, quantity of money, nominal interest rates. If there is an expansionary monetary policy, the money supply shifts right. The result is a decrease in interest rates. And if we were to graph monetary policy on the loanable funds graph, we'd see the same thing, a decrease in interest rates. And a decrease in interest rates leads to what concerning SIGEX? It leads to more gross private investment. Gross private investment is the thing that monetary policy ultimately affects in order to affect the aggregate model. So, let's go ahead and graph monetary policy on aggregate supply and demand graph. Price level, long run, aggregate supply. Let's put ourselves into a recession here. Short run, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, real GDP, and full employment. This is a recessionary economy. We need to do an expansionary monetary policy. The way that's going to look is simply increasing aggregate demand. That's how you do a graph of expansionary monetary policy. It's a demand-side policy just like fiscal policy is. Now, the reasoning is different. The reason aggregate demand went up is because the Fed increased the money supply, which decreased interest rates, which increased gross private investment. Now, for our big finale, we're going to put all three graphs side by side, and we're going to show an expansionary monetary policy on all three graphs. So here we go. All right, here we are. we have a money market graph, we have a loanable funds graph, we have an aggregate supply and demand model for an economy in a recession. What is the appropriate monetary policy? That would be expansionary monetary policy. Briefly, I'll go through the options. Of all of the things that the Fed could do, the thing they probably will do is open market operations, and expansionary open market operations are buying big. Buy bonds, right? Of course, buying bonds is what they do to achieve a lower Fed funds rate. The other things they could do is decreasing the discount rate, although they probably wouldn't do it. And the thing they definitely least would do, but they could, is lowering the required reserve ratio. But this is probably what they do. So what does it look like? Well, this is expansionary monetary policy, so here we go. There you have it. That's how it looks on all of our graphs. Now, we could have done a contractionary monetary policy. We could have done an expansionary fiscal policy. We could have done a contractionary fiscal policy. What you need to do right now, and the practice will hopefully help you get there, is when you are done with this lesson, you need to be able to draw all three of these graphs, of course. You need to be able to apply a expansionary monetary policy and an expansionary fiscal policy to all graphs. You need to be able to apply a contractionary monetary policy and a contractionary fiscal policy to both graphs. And ultimately, you need to be able to apply both policies at the same time to all of these graphs. And the one thing that I'll finish us off with is we're going to go ahead and revisit our old friend, crowding out. The whole argument about crowding out is that increased government borrowing to fund deficits drives up interest rates. So what that looks like on the loanable funds graph was an increase in the demand for loanable funds. However, what we can see here is that by having a coordinated monetary policy, because we've already got our increase in supply from the monetary policy, you can actually maintain interest rates at the same level even though you're doing an expansionary fiscal policy. That's kind of a big deal. So if the Fed and Congress coordinate and both do an expansionary policy, you're going to get the expansionary benefit, but you're not going to drive up interest rates. So we have effectively mitigated the impact of crowding out. So until next time, that's where I'm going to leave you. Get to practice. You need to be doing all of this graphing. There's only one more graph in this entire course, but these three graphs are very important. They're going to help you on multiple choice questions because you're going to know all about what happens to interest rates during monetary and fiscal policies. And also, you're going to be expected to draw these graphs on FRQs, and you always need to be able to manipulate your aggregate supply and demand graph. So, good luck, and I will see you next time.